of the vehicle and the house, where we try to rethink the role of the vehicle and its relationship with the house. The relationship between the house and the vehicle is explored at the macro scale, that is structure and space, and at the micro scale, that is skin and furniture system. A few precedents that we looked at exploring this relationship between vehicle and architecture were the Villa Savoy, Mercedes-Benz Museum, and Citroen's Evo Mobile car. The research was divided into three main strands of exploration: continuity of structure and space, lightweight materiality and fabrication, and integration of vehicle, spatial, and furniture systems. The design for the house began as proposing an alternative structural system to the Mason domino, where the Mason domino proposed a structural and spatial element system. We propose a structural model in which floors, columns, circulation are neither conceptually nor materially separated.
And the site for the design is located along Regent's Canal, London. The site has on the one side the canal and the other the roads, allowing for the boat and the car interface.
The design for the house began with exploring continuous surfaces. Initial geometrical variations of helicoidal surfaces were developed and then set up with boundary conditions and size constraints. Combinations of these variations were made using single loop and double loop helicoids. With that, we developed a prototypical structural model. Here, a helicoidal spine was the core structural member, branching out in the form of ribs, supporting the surrounding spaces and also allowing for circulatory functions. This prototype was next deployed on site using site constraints and the different site datums. Two different accesses to the structure are proposed: a narrow vehicle access and a pedestrian access from the side. Next, we explored material and fabrication techniques that can be used for the structure. The materials that we explored were reinforced polymers, plastics, and reinforced carbon fiber, and prefabrication techniques like vacuum forming and thermoforming were also explored. This was one of the prototypes developed using these techniques. Here, the pleating of the surface is based on stiffness factor analysis, and the fiber reinforcement is based on the stress analysis. The next prototype explored was a composite shell and variable thickness, and was similarly analyzed for stiffness and stress. Surface pleating, again surface pleating based on stiffness, and reinforcement based on stress isolines. This prototype was made using double layers of plastics formed with the help of pre-milled molds. Part section of our house model was developed using this technique. For the envelope, we propose a free facade considering only wind loads. Concave and anti-clastic geometry is proposed as it performs better against wind loads. Different variations of surface patterning based on stress pattern were developed, which could be used for developing the openings. Also, different tessellation based on stiffness analysis were explored while developing the skin. Using these techniques, one of the variations for the skin was developed, which shows different mesh tessellations translated into openings. Another variation of the skin was developed using a membrane reinforced with fiber patterns, which was an output from the stress analysis. And next, a combined version of these techniques, which showed mesh tessellation translated into higher and lower levels of opacity and translucency, and again reinforced with fibers. This shows the different accesses to the house, the narrow vehicle access and the pedestrian entry from the side. And this is one of the views showing of the house.
And our approach to the car design began with considering relationships between house and vertical. The idea has to explore how the car can be more than just vertical. consider the entrance conditions to the house, we started investigating a flight and smaller car option, also looking at the different sitting positions that can be incorporated. And we started with simple variations using geometric optimizations of the car parts and skeletons, and developed different iterations. Some iterations are tested with airflow simulations. The next set of iterations developed with the application of flow simulation lines.
We also looked at developing wheels for the house. Here we used a process of dynamic mesh relaxation based on initial voxel geometries. And these were some of the iterations developed. Here we considered a circular cylindrical geometry and developed a quarter part of it.
And about the video shows the furniture integrations possibilities of the vertical prototype were explored using a simple model with hinge points. Yeah. And for the next, this analog study allowed to develop a catalog of possible furniture integrations. And those the car enveloped with every fabrications incorporated the transforming functions. Next, to develop the spatial and furniture divisions, one of the floor is considered, and the structure, scheme, and cooperations areas are used as initial reference. Next, based on curvature mapping of the floor surface, spatial divisions are divided. And these divisions are overlaid with the structure analysis of the surface. And based on these different furniture layouts are exported. The car integrates different parts that can plug into the furniture systems. And the interface of the car parts are soft materials to allow greater furniture applications. And one of the possibility applications, the rear two parts can function as a seat.
These are some images of the car with the skin. And an entire image showing one of the possibilities for the interior space. Thank you. Some of the models, prototypes for the house, initial simple vacuum form study. This one was a composite developed using carbon fiber and plastic. These were the vacuum form studies using the pre-milled molds. This was a double layer composite that we developed using these studies. Path section model, entire section model of the house, context model, the final prototype of the car, prototype of the furniture, initial car iterations. This was initial study for the transformation part, the study model based on hinge, and another set of vehicle iterations.
Well, I can start if you want. One thing that strikes me, I mean, first of all, it's a very, I still think it's so interesting to design a car and a house that somehow look alike or that have a similar agenda. I find that a kind of an interesting proposition. So that to say about the project, I guess about the studio agenda, first of all. I think that your project is very clearly explained, so thank you very much for that. Maybe the one thing that strikes me the most is that, especially when you show the flow diagram of the car, it seems that it's an obvious thing why your car would be symmetric, because you drive forward and somehow you have the same kind of pressure of the wind when you drive forward. But why would the house be symmetric? That is a little bit the question mark that I have. And why? Because I think that this notion of flow in the house is not in motion and eventually is reacting to its environment. So you would imagine that the flow of the environment, especially when the buildings around this house are so different, right and left, that the flow of air, if anything, would be different on one side than the other. And if you would associate this question of flow to the movement throughout the house or other notions of program and other notions of inhabiting that space, I think it's very, very difficult that you would end up with a symmetrical scheme. So to me, this is where the project is not so strong. In a way that I really, really appreciate the fact that there is this kind of language continuity, if you want, between the house and the car. But I would have expected that the house is an opportunity to really push what can be done with this tectonic continuity that you're talking about, especially when you can fiber reinforce certain elements here and there when you begin to differentiate the stresses that are happening in the structure. So it's a little bit where I wish that the project was going a little bit further.
I want to pick up on a few little things. I mean, stylistically, this is very interesting, and the whole concept of the link between the vehicles and the accommodation is also very interesting. But there's a couple of things you've hit on which are kind of bugbears of mine in academia and in industry as a whole. One of those is the approach that you said earlier on about optimization for the house. And you didn't set any parameters. If it's optimization for material use, then you just don't build it. So you need to have other parameters around that which actually drive the form and give you something that you're working towards. Secondly, the science behind the car, you studied the flow lines and then you imprinted those flow lines on the car, but you didn't show what that did, what benefit that was or where that was leading. These things have to be an iterative process. They have to take steps and you have to learn and grow from each step, and that's how these things develop into something that has a tangible benefit. And then finally on the integration between the furniture and the vehicle, I think it needed to be, you needed some proper details on that, how that connection worked, what that did. So for me, there were a lot of interesting ideas, but they lacked a bit in context and they lacked a bit in detail at either end.
There's a microphone on that half.
Yes, there is one.
Another microphone is going to stay on this half. So it's not potato.
For me personally, this is one of the hottest topics in this century, like the renegotiation of architecture, urban space, and mobility. So, you know, it's amazing to see how you approach it. I think, I mean, if we ask ourselves, like, who owns a car here, basically, I think it's, you know, probably, I don't know, 10 people in this room, 15 maybe. The younger they get, the less they own it. We should take this topic really serious and like also fundamentally ask ourselves, what is the, you know, the architecture of a car? Is it still owned by someone? Is it driven by one person as you show it? So how does it look like? Is it going to be propelled by gas, by electricity? What does it mean for the architecture of the car? What is the function? It's bringing people from A to B. I don't know if it's going to be a kind of emotional aspect in the future. I think there will be old-timers do that job. I think, you know, the future vehicles will be much more kind of, you know, efficient, time-saving, all these aspects. I think there was one moment in your presentation in the very beginning where you used a domino house and kept it in the scale of a house. I think if you would have scaled this up in a sense of a neighborhood, not necessarily a whole city that is stacked, but maybe a neighborhood, I think then the project, you know, could have developed, or like, you know, could be totally rethought in a different scale, and therefore that's why I see a huge potential in there. And therefore also maybe a formula connection between a house and a car could have been questioned or could have been rethought, decoupled from each other.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I'm looking in a way for deformations. I'm sort of assuming that there was a house design and then there was a sort of a vehicle design. It sort of seems like the way you presented the work is in a very linear fashion. You went from sort of point A to point B, and I wonder a little bit if the vehicle itself hasn't been fed back into the design process. It seems like an application of a car. It sort of slides in. It doesn't necessarily deform the house, right? The house doesn't necessarily yield to it. There isn't kind of feedback happening in many ways between the two. It's sort of an object in a kind of womb without any nesting, say. And you know, this sort of rendering over here is emblematic of that. You know, there is no sort of, you don't feel the weight of the car. I'm sure the car is very lightweight, but you would sense that there would be a car in it, even to the point where you would imagine in the rendering that when the car has arrived, or multiple cars have arrived, that it would emanate some kind of communication would happen between the two. And I don't really get that sense, okay? And it probably has something to do with the linearity in many ways of the design process. And you know, there's this fascinating, when I was at the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit, I found this like sort of obscure, very small photograph on a wall. And I was so curious about it. It was an old Model A, pulled up to kind of basically an American house. The hood of the car was open, and there was belts running from the car into the garage of the house. So literally, it was powering the house. And I started to do some research about this. And Henry Ford's idea was that the house, in many ways, would be powered by this automobile. You wouldn't have to have two separate systems, that there would be this kind of energy feedback between the two. And I was, you know, really fascinated by this. And I found that to be just so quirky and fantastic, that the two would be communicating. And I can't help but wonder about the car and all of the innovations that are happening right now in automotive design in terms of how they're propelling themselves through different kind of energy sources, and how sort of held back, let's say, domestic architecture generally, and that the two could begin to kind of feedback. And so for me, it's disappointing that say the energy systems or the kind of infrastructure of the house and the car don't begin to have some communication. And certainly with things like entertainment, you know, that could clearly begin to happen. But I think in a more fundamental level, I wonder about the glow of the house, and where is that glow kind of coming from? And I'd love to sort of fantasize that in fact is happening, because the car is in a way the thing that gives the house its kind of pulse. When the car isn't there, the house is sort of mute, right? It's like calcified, like very much like your models. It has no livelihood. But when the automobile is a part of it, it's the kind of pulsation, the kind of heart, the kind of, you know, the kind of aura that you're getting there. And it's really the car that provides that.
Well, thanks for the poetic elaboration. I think it's quite in the spirit of what the project is trying to achieve. I mean, the importance for the Maison Dominique comparison is just to look back at the generic system and particular structure of the modernist era. We had a homogeneous slab, a homogeneous, internally homogeneous column, a homogeneous repetition of column spacing, which was all driven by the fabrication technologies and the lack of also of calculating more nuanced and differentiated systems. So, and what is optimized against, once you compare to this, would be weight. And we haven't made that calculation, but that's something which would be the measure for me, a comparable size of structure. Advantages are similar: open space, open facade, and then a far lighter structure. which is differentiated out, including, so carbon fiber, composite instead of concrete, a tensile or facade versus a glass facade, etc. I mean, where the car comes in, I agree that there should and could have been more action, reaction, responsiveness. But in terms of the way the building recognizes it is the very low car slips through that low gap at the back as an unusual entrance. And the other thing is that all the circulation elements are car friendly, so the car moves across the levels on these ramps, while the tighter curves are stepped and become kind of staircases, and yet it tightens into a structural moment connection, in fact, which is similar to the Maison Domino idea. So these are the attempts to. That's why it also wasn't elaborated into something larger. It's that kind of juxtaposition, and it's also 100 years of Maison Domino, a theme of which the AA also picked up on in terms of the Biennale, and we might do further things here with that theme. So.
Hello. Yeah, I think we're all quite familiar with the sort of structural system in the house. We understand it as a sort of reinforced concrete plate, or maybe it's this fiber reinforced system. But I find the vehicle, it's definitely a less familiar ground for everybody here, and it would be useful if that project, if that was taken further in terms of the material system. It is optimized for the form, but beyond that, there's no suggestion of how this thing could exist in the real world with, as you said, connections, but more so the functions of the rest of the vehicle. So there's no engine and there's nowhere for the wheels to attach and these sorts of things. So it just would be nice to see that level of resolution maybe equal to the building itself.
And just picking up on that, I think that's one part of the project that hasn't really been explored, which is like there is a tentative kind of argument that the car becomes the interior of the house. So almost like a plug-and-play system, that the car is still treated kind of holistically, but if it is to meet the demands of the home and the idea of the interior, then it's almost like a car shop, where you have a whole redundancy of different components, and then the car would actually potentially change its character. And the house itself, I think, has to have much more symbiotic relationships. Energy is one, interfacing, not just entry and exit of this thing, but actually how this thing becomes an ecology of reconsidering the notion of a machine. So I think the core argumentation can become a real speculative playground of actually seeing these things with a much deeper integration. So the Ford example is really interesting, but there are pilot programs as well in Germany which are basically energy offset systems with electric cars and electric homes, and it becomes part of this idea where the house now also becomes a piece of infrastructure, and the domain of that isn't relegated to a site, so mobility now starts to open up. I think a really interesting place where you guys should start to see the project, not with a divide between vehicle and building, but really to try to blur those lines where components of the home and the performative qualities of these things, which is, I think, where for me, I think the project could really continue and develop from, is the research part of how those components now can really sort of function. Because that hybridity, I think, is where this kind of work would go. And I think in one sense, the house itself is also a prototype. And I think in the presentation, it's important to see it not as one home, but really as a way to sort of inquire about what actually living actually means, right? So the idea of ownership was sort of questioned, but also the idea of this kind of holistic kind of total design that has a very particular interface with the street is also something that can be explored. And for me, what's probably most pressing is how you would want to engage that dialogue. What interface really means between the public and the private in some sense, how that sort of gets a slippage when you start to think about the vehicle And just generally speaking, how you see this as a prototype, just the same way that Corp thought, because then I think the deployment of this has degrees of magnitude and resolution, which becomes, I think, really interesting for you guys to speculate. And because you have 2 weeks to put together your final document, I think the way that you've presented the project is as a design proposal. And I think the research aspect of where performance, particularly on how these components work and operate and the decision making, I think is really important to highlight as you guys work in the next coming weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I think the potency of the studio provocation has really been unfolded here in the project. And the project itself comes radically from two different sides. This sort of spatial reconsideration of Maison Domino that says that if you have a radical integration of structure, space, and material, that this could change the way you would design radically and change the opportunities. The ultimate manifestation of that, I would have thought, would have been that your structural ribs and these things which are necessary to reinforce the structure would have become programmatic seeds and vice versa, that you need certain deformations to create programmatic opportunities that provide the structural outcome and so forth, which is ironically hinted at this drawing, which was actually presented as a furniture strategy, but should have been in a way the opposite. And then at the other end, you have this idea that the car, which is mobile, and which, as Patrick says, has actually access to the whole house, which is unusual, becomes the furniture, and we're sitting on the car. So this is the exactly antithetical strategy, which is that opposed to radical specialization, you have flexibility through movability. And I like this idea of Theo, that if the car fragments and becomes many things, then this traversable terrain means that you can reconfigure your space because the furniture is a vehicle. Your car is the furniture, but I think your furniture should have been a car. And then I think the tension between those two spaces could be really provocative. If you said, okay, the limits to this radical specialization and integration is that we have these inhabited ridges and rooms that are stiffening elements, but that they somehow are not quite capable of providing all the things necessary for the true house experience. And then you supplement that by this reconfigurable series of vehicles that are somehow furnitures that allow this thing to change. And maybe thinking of this image, which is quite funny and archaic with these mechanical hinges. And of course, suggestive in your research is this flexural hinge from the kind of reprogrammable material. That I like the idea that maybe these movable furnitures could actually change counterbalances and tip and open flexible parts of the building. So these things come into direct play, and so they don't just conceptually complement each other, but they, in practical sense, also complement each other.
Something I think you could kind of articulate a bit in the book document that I think is an interesting take is the relation of the project to technology. Like, I mean, it fits into a context where you have things like Maison Domino that's arguing that architecture should be of a technology similar to other industries, to people like Rana Banham questioning what architecture might be with the application of technology, to even London with high-tech architecture where you see kind of an expression of assemblage and things like that. And here what we see is that the technology's all being put into the car in an interesting way. So if you think of, say, the way we have now with constant refresh rates of electronic technology, where you buy a product and 2 years later it's done with, it's of no value, it kind of makes sense to dislocate, I think, the space and the structure from all the services. I mean, Whitetricity just has been publishing a lot lately, showing that we don't even need electrical circuits to be embedded anymore in the architecture. So the idea that the architecture could just be structure and form and space, and the materiality that defines the enclosing environment, I think is an interesting take. And then to say that, you know, something like the car, which already has, as we've discussed now, different, today we have different technologies for powering the car and to sharing that power with other sources, such as a house. And then it has a stereo, it has communications. All these things no longer need fixed infrastructure, including telephone networks. So the take that the vehicle becomes the furniture, and then that's the interesting tie, that there's actually something in the articulation of the architecture, at least implied, I think, on this panel here, where it tries to relate that furniture back to the house. And I think that's one thing that you could also express more, because if suddenly we're stripping out all the functional relationships, it would be nice to have more of a design relationship so that we really experience the fact that these two things operate together. So I think it's a really interesting project, and this could definitely be elaborated on in the book.
I think if you've got something which is obsessively concerned here with bilateral symmetry, you've got two options at this point. You either really hammer that obsession and explore what the implications of this, this bilateral symmetry are. Because first of all, even an aeroplane is actually often slightly asymmetrical, because the airflow has to break either side. So you could start, if you're going to be obsessive, at that level of sophistication. Or you could go the other way and say, having got this far, then you could take into consideration the more complex issues. Like, for example, most of the consideration with airflow over cars is when they're turning, where the airflow turns, as they go between other traffic, and they're buffeted sideways by the car. You could take it one way or the other, and it seems to me that both the house and the car are caught at the moment in limbo, halfway between being absolutely obsessive and halfway to starting to explore other kind of complexity. And I think this is a real decision point here, and if it's right, you've only got 2 weeks left. That seems to me that some fairly quite radical thinking, or even rewriting what it was you think you were trying to do at this point. A deep breath, it seems to me, is necessary to push it over the edge at this point.